Good afternoon, class, and happy Monday. Today we find ourselves in the great Greek city-state of Athens, where we'll be for the next 2 weeks, more or less. Um, I wanted to start off today by quickly saying a few things about the history of the Athenian democracy, which is where a great deal of the events we'll be talking about transpire. So I included a PDF with 3 pages that you could refer to while I'm talking about this. Um, I'm now looking at the first page of that, which is The Rise of Athenian Democracy. So you could have that next to you while you listen to what I have to say about the rise of Athens. So, right off the bat, the first thing that I would like to suggest to you, which is very special about Athens, is that in Greece at this period of time, there was a very unique set of circumstances that led to the gap between the ruling class and the ruled class to be world historically small. So, for the first time in world history, there was a group of rulers, a group of aristocrats and people who were in control and owned the land, and a group of peasants and farm workers and craftsmen who were ruled by them, who came to be very close in their relative amounts of power, and that led to a whole bunch of very interesting phenomena. If you take a look over here at the first plot point, in the 7th century BC, Athens started to absorb a lot of other city-states, and it got bigger and bigger. And much like the situation leading up to Hammurabi's code, wherein Hammurabi conquered a lot of other cities and brought them under his rule, and then had to use his code as one of the tools for weaving together that empire, Athens also found itself in a whole series of contradictions. But unlike Hammurabi, the rulers of Athens were not supreme monarchs, but instead they were a collection of aristocrats whose power came from owning the land on which the other people worked. And there was a great deal of social unrest, particularly when peasants from one area were ruled by aristocrats that, again, bore no connection to them, people who had conquered their area. And so there was a great deal of social unrest from all of the people who, were controlled but had no voice in their own lives anymore. The first attempt to deal with that, or one of the first attempts, was by a politician named Draco. And he laid down these extremely restrictive laws, really cracking down very hard on the farmers, cracking down very hard on the poor. And in response to Draco's laws, there were just a huge chain of revolts and riots, and so they were very unsuccessful. And in modern day English, the word draconian means oppressive or extreme. So if I had a draconian grading policy, uh, I might only give out one A, two Bs, and all the rest would be Fs. This would be a really draconian grading policy. Luckily for you, I am not a draconian professor. But in any case, after that failure, Solon came along. And he made a whole bunch of reforms, giving the right to vote to more people than it had ever been, the right to participate in politics. He eased the tax burden, and he gave a much bigger voice to the peasant population of Greece at the time, of Athens, excuse me. And so Solon is this first real benchmark in the history of democracy. A little while later, there was a big fight for control of Athenian democracy, over Athenian society, sorry, by two aristocrats, so Hippias and Cleisthenes. And these two figures were both very powerful, sort of clashing with each other for who was going to control Athens. That at that time, it had a broader sort of democratic participation from Solon's reforms, but it was still more or less an aristocracy. Cleisthenes, though, had a brilliant idea. And this was a very significant and historically consequential idea. In his fight with Hippias, he decided to recruit uh, the peasants and the wider population of Athens at that time to his side. And so he established this concept called the deme, which was originally a Greek word for your community. And he created a political body called the ecclesia, or the assembly. And it was an assembly of the demes, and it deliberated upon and even made some of the laws in Athens. And this was, since there was an assembly of the demes, the very beginning of democratia, or the power of the people, rule by the people. Um, because people were no longer in power as in an aristocracy through their inheritance, but instead they were in power because of where they lived in a given community, in a deme. And so democracy was understood as the rule of the many, or the rule of the people. Um, However, there was still this other element, which was the Areopagus, which was an aristocratic council. And so the Areopagus and the Ecclesia, the aristocrats and the democracy, existed in a kind of unstable mix for a while. Um, at that point, Athens played a very crucial role in a very important series of wars. The first is the Persian War, wherein the Persian Empire sought to invade and crush Greece. And the two big warriors on the side of Greece, or the two big countries, if you want, they were polises. We'll get to that in a bit. But the city-states were Athens and Sparta, in any case. And as you'll see, towards the end of the war, there was the very famous Battle of Thermopylae, which is, if you've ever seen the movie 300, where you have the "For Sparta!" kicking the guy and fighting off the Persians. The movie 300 captures the Battle of Thermopylae. That was Sparta's role. And then in the Battle of Salamis, Athens crushed the Persian navy at great cost to themselves. And then in Plataea, decisively beat the Persians. And so the Athenians were renowned throughout Greece for having defended the Grecian peninsula against the Persians. And after that war, Athens was then extremely wealthy, and a huge amount of money flowed into Athens because of this very central role they played in the war. And you get this character, one of the most famous Athenian leaders of all time, Pericles. And so Pericles was born a little bit before the Persian War, and he rose to power in its aftermath. And so he sort of built on Cleisthenes' work, and in his struggle with his rival, who was named Cimon, he went to an even more extreme level, and so stripped the Areopagus, stripped the aristocracy of a lot of its power, and put power very dramatically in the hands of the assembly. And so Pericles is remembered as a radical democrat, as someone who put a huge amount of power. And remember, he's an aristocrat, so keep in mind when you're considering Pericles that he is not a pauper. He comes from a very noble family and was a strategos, or a general, in the war that we're about to talk about. So he's very, very renowned, but nevertheless advocated for the people. Again, partially as a way to counteract another aristocrat, but it had very concrete consequences, which was to expand Athenian democracy dramatically. Pericles is also famous for having funded the arts, particularly tragedy and comedy. He was the one who commissioned the Parthenon to be built, and perhaps most significantly for us, he formed the Delian League. Now, the Delian League was originally a collection of different city-states that Athens had influence over, and so bit by bit took more and more power with respect to them. They paid certain taxes to Athens, and Athens agreed to protect them. Remember, this is in the aftermath of the Persian War, where Athens had defended all of Greece. But over time, the Delian League really evolved into an Athenian empire, where Athens ruled and decided on law for a great deal of other places outside of Athens. And crucially, and this will also bear on our discussions about Athenian democracy, other colonies of Athens were not invited to vote on Athenian law. They were subject to it. And so at the same time that you have democracy coming into existence, you have a complicated question about what about the people who are subject to democracy's laws. In order to be commanded by a democracy, is it necessary that you're allowed to participate? Or can a democracy rule over certain other people who aren't allowed to vote? Also, to bear in the back of your mind, and it will become only more significant, the Athenian democracy, even under Pericles, there were a great deal of people who weren't allowed to participate. One example were so-called metics, who were legal immigrants to Athens. So a legal immigrant to Athens couldn't vote, women could not vote, and slaves could not vote. And in fact, Athens had a very large slave population. And slaves in ancient Greece were not imported from other parts of the world. Slaves were defeated warriors of another army, who you, instead of killing them, you offered them the opportunity to work without pay. And so it's a better way of thinking about slaves in the context of Greece were captives or prisoners of war forced to labor, but a huge amount of them. And they were certainly not allowed to vote. So women, slaves, legal immigrants, children, all of these were groups that were not allowed to vote, and particularly also the colonies of Athens, which will become very important imminently. So in any case, this is the background. This is the Athenian democracy at its height as an Athenian empire. However, the old protagonist of Athens from the Persian War, Sparta, eventually had a bone to pick with this expanding power of Athens. And this provoked the Peloponnesian War, which was a clash, intra-Greek clash, a clash between the two great Greek powers, Athens versus Sparta, and all of their allies clashing against each other. At the beginning of the war, Athens was doing fairly well, but there was all kinds of setbacks. One very dramatic setback was a plague that struck Athens in the middle of the war, early on in the war, in 430, just 1 year in. And it was in the context of that war. Athens is at war with Sparta. A terrible plague has come, and the plague undermined everyone's belief that their cause was just. So, as you might know, in the ancient world, if there was an earthquake or a plague or a fire, it was often seen as unlucky or as indicating that the gods did not support whatever was happening, did not support the mission. And so Pericles found himself, as the leader of Athens at that time, having to reassure and inspire the Athenian people in the context of this set of setbacks. And that's the scene in which he delivers his famous funeral oration. So it's a speech he gives while burying several dead soldiers from Athens. And in it, he presents a bunch of the ideas why Athens was worth dying for. In other words, to reconvince people that fighting for Athens, fighting to defend Athens, fighting to expand Athens, perhaps, is a worthwhile cause. That Athens is a legitimate society defending its honor. And this also, in the context of that speech, then Pericles gives us one of our best documents from the ancient world, explaining the logic behind democracy. Why democracy, in Pericles' view, is the best form of government, and why it's worth dying for in that sense. So we'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to finish contextualizing this for you. So that's where we get the first text that we're reading this week. However, very soon after giving his funeral oration, Pericles' sons died, both of them. And then, soon enough, Pericles himself died. So after that point, there was a great deal. The battle continued on. The battle continued for decades. And somewhere in the middle of the war, Athens began really pushing hard on all of its allies, who had sort of either been around it or neutral. And even neutral parties, islands who said, look, we don't want to pick Athens or Sparta. Athens turned to a policy of asking them to decide whose side they're on. And if you're going to be on our side, you need to pay tribute to us. And if you're against us, then we're going to crush you, invade you, and take your stuff, take all of your resources. And one such island was the island of Milos, that had requested to be neutral in the war. And Athens refused and said, you need to choose a side. And either you're going to pay us taxes and be on our side, or we're going to take you to be an enemy and crush you. And Milos, in that moment, said, but wait a minute, we thought you were a democracy who had all of these sorts of ideas of right and justice. How could you do this? And Athens set out to explain its reasons why. And that gives us our second text that we're looking at, which is the Melian Dialogue. And these sort of present two sides of the concept of Athenian democracy. On the one hand, Pericles, the great democrat, explaining why Athenian democracy is great. And then on the other hand, the Melian Dialogue showing how democracy has a dark side, so to speak, especially when it meets other countries. In any case, 14 years afterwards, 12 years afterwards, Athens lost. Athens lost the war. And as a consequence, Sparta disbanded their democracy and imposed an oligarchy. So it sort of chose 30 different people, who were later called the 30 tyrants, to rule over Athens in place of their democracy. And that only lasted for 8 months, although it was very brutal. The 30 tyrants killed 5% of the Athenian population. They were very paranoid to stay in power. So it was a very bloody time in Athenian history after the war. Sort of might remind you of the Reconstruction of the South in the American Civil War. It was this very intense period when the conquered region, in this case Athens, was subjected to Spartan rule. After 8 months, the Athenian Thrasybulus led the restoration of democracy. And so democracy was finally restored about a year after the end of the war. And right off the bat, they were very suspicious of all Athenians who had stayed behind during the reign of the 30 tyrants. So in other words, especially if you were an aristocrat, if you hadn't escaped, the implication was that you were a collaborator, that you had collaborated with the oligarchy, and that you were hostile to the goals of democracy. And there was one Athenian soldier who had fought in the Peloponnesian War bravely, an Athenian soldier, who, once the Spartans took over, didn't leave, but instead stayed in Athens during this whole period of time. And once the democracy was restored, he was brought up on criminal charges for anti-democratic activities, specifically corrupting the democratic youth and turning them against the principles of democracy. And this figure is Socrates. And so more information on this later. I'll pick back up with you on who is Socrates. But yeah, this is now the moment where Socrates comes on the scene. At the end of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates, who had fought in the war and did not come from a rich background, was accused by the very new democracy, still very shaky and just having recovered from the aristocracy that had been imposed by Sparta. So okay, that's the whole sort of historical tableau leading up to the funeral oration of Pericles, the Melian dialogue, and then the trial of Socrates, which is going to concern us in the second half of the week. So to get you started thinking, I just wanted to call your attention to 4 Greek words that occur or are referred to in Pericles' funeral oration, since this is his justification of democracy. So right off the bat on page 73, and by the way, you can take a look now at the second page of the handout that I've put up. He talks about democracy, wherein power is not in the hands of a minority, but of the whole people. This is just a good point of reference for the fact that Pericles is talking about democracy explicitly. He's praising Athens because it is a democracy, the form of our government. One of the really key concepts is isonomia, or equality before the law. And this is something we've already talked about when we were talking about Hammurabi. And it's the idea that when it comes to a question of settling disputes, everyone is before the law, private disputes. And when it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the person possesses. No one, so long as he has it in him to be of service to the state, is kept in political obscurity because of poverty. So there's a couple of elements here, and you might notice right off the bat how this goes a little bit beyond Hammurabi. First of all, there's a distinction of private and public, which is starting to come out, which you could imagine already exists in Hammurabi's code. But Hammurabi's code, if you notice, is almost across the board about private affairs. That's its main focus, at least, is how to adjudicate private things that happen among people in their interaction as spouses, husbands and wives, in their interactions along the street, in their private transactions between a tavern keeper or a physician or a builder of a house, and not so much overall laws about how people should act in public, and particularly, any kind of election of officials. This is a sort of a much less of a topic of the Code of Hammurabi. So yeah, this distinction between public and private, that's only going to become more important, this distinction of public and private. But you could see it already cropping up in this idea In any case, isonomia, equality before the law, both in terms of how it applies to you in private disputes, but also here in terms of public office. Class should not be a barrier. And right away, this should remind you of the issue of class in Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, how in Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, uh, there's a big point about the importance of separating out financial motives from justice questions. And Pericles is picking right up on that. And so for him, and this is interesting, isonomia, or equality before the law, both means that the law should apply fairly, and that similarly to Hammurabi, and it should apply universally and fairly, and the law should bracket and put aside, push away questions of social class and economic class, which should remind you of Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. And so already in this idea of isonomia, one way of reading this and one way of seeing what's going on here is as Athenian democracy is combining themes of classical justice and the classical critique of justice. So both, it's sort of, if you want, one part Hammurabi, one part Eloquent Peasant, a critical concept of justice that's at the same time a justification. So this should start going in your head. The second key principle of democracy for Pericles is eleutheria. And this is a strange word. There's not really a very good translation in the ancient world, and it's questionable how good a translation the word freedom even is. But eleutheria is not autonomia. It's not giving yourself the law. It's a much broader and free-flowing concept that's not really tied down so clearly. So here's a couple of elements of eleutheria. Just as our political life is free and open, and that's what he's referring to with isonomia, that's free and openness of political life, so is our day-to-day life in our relationships with each other. We don't get into a state with our next-door neighbor if he enjoys himself in his own way, nor do we give him black looks, which, though they do no real harm, still do hurt people's feelings. We're free and tolerant in our private lives. So far, notice what a strange and interesting contrast this is with really everything we've read. Herein, we go even beyond anything that's happening in either Code of Hammurabi or Tale of the Eloquent Peasant to a full-blown concern with the emotional reality of the citizens of a democracy. That one of the key justifications is this kind of tolerance of difference, a kind of freedom of affect, a freedom of emotion, a freedom of culture, and these as really key principles for the democracy. And so this is sort of what we were talking about in my response video as negative freedom. There's a negative freedom, in other words, you can do whatever you want. You're not compelled to choose what art you like, what food you want to eat, and you're allowed to pursue romantic love. You're allowed to pursue at least desire, loving someone who you find beautiful or interesting. However, and here comes the positive law side, in other words, the ability to do something, legislated ability to do something, the laws that tell you how to do things, but in a way that actually increases your freedom. So here we go, continuing to read. But in public affairs, we keep to the law. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are for the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break. And here is another point. When our work is over, we are in a position to enjoy all kinds of recreation for our spirits. There are various kinds of contests and sacrifices regularly. In our homes, we find a beauty and a good taste which delight us every day and which drive away our cares. So this is a great combination of positive and negative freedom. The negative freedom is this, the delights and the goods and all this sort of thing that you can pursue at your own will, choosing your own interest. And the positive freedom is the context for that. So notice his argument. He's saying that obedience to these sorts of laws, obedience to authority and to the law, especially those to protect the oppressed, this should trigger something in your memory, and the unwritten laws, which, in parentheses, what's an unwritten law? What's an unwritten law? Think about that. This is a very significant idea, the difference between written and unwritten laws. And think also about the Code of Hammurabi as a written law. What is an unwritten law? What's the significance of that? I'll put that in a little parenthesis for talking about later. But in any case, so there's this outside law that following that law is part of freedom for a Greek. It's not actually being a slave. It's not some kind of being controlled to follow the law. As long as the law promotes your freedom, and as long as the law creates positively the type of freedom that can allow you negatively to do whatever you want, to choose your sort of cultural goods, what kind of food you want to eat, what kind of art you want to enjoy. So this Greek concept of eleutheria is very important. And finally, this idea of isegoria, which is equal speech. Now, a common way to translate isegoria is as freedom of speech, but I'd actually suggest to you that's a bad translation. Because freedom of speech is a 18th century concept. It's really a 19th century concept. Very contemporary. In ancient Greece, the idea wasn't this idea of, well, you can say whatever you want in a free marketplace. Isegoria was a positive valuation of speech. In other words, our law is just because people are free, and not only free, but encouraged, commanded, and shamed if they don't contribute their voices and their ideas in public. Take a look at this passage. Here, in Athens, each individual is interested not only in his own affairs, but in the affairs of the state as well. Even those who are mostly occupied with their own business are extremely well informed on general politics. This is a peculiarity of ours. We do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business. We say that he has no business here at all. We Athenians, in our own persons, take our decisions on policy or submit them to proper discussions, for we do not think that there is an incompatibility between words and deeds. The worst thing is to rush into action before the consequences have been properly debated, and this is another point where we differ from other people. We are capable at the same time of taking risks and of estimating them beforehand. Others are brave out of ignorance, and when they stop to think they begin to fear. But the man who can truly be accounted brave is he who best knows the meaning of what is sweet in life and of what is terrible, and then goes out undeterred to meet what is to come. This is a really cool passage, no? This is a really amazing passage. So what are some of the things that are going on here? Right off the bat, this idea that everyone participates in assessing matters of public policy. And why? Because they're also really well informed. Herein you find a deep connection between the idea of education and the idea of democracy. Why is that important? Because if in a democracy the idea is that the masses will make a decision together, how could we trust that? Isn't it true that the masses are all idiots? That, if we turn democracy over to the hands of a majority, what's to say that the majority is not just going to make a really stupid decision? Pericles is giving one of the classic answers that a democracy can answer, which is, our people are very educated, and we have a public education system that makes democracy rational. If we didn't have a public education system, and we couldn't say that, for instance, in our state everyone's extremely well informed on general politics, then it would be irrational for them to make those collective political decisions. So this is a very important point. This is exactly where Socrates is going to start hammering away at democracy in being very skeptical and very doubting of this idea that, in fact, everyone is extremely well informed on general politics. But you can see, very importantly, the connection between education and democracy. This is going to go all the way for the whole rest of the history of democracy. Every Democrat, or not, well, whatever, many a Democrat, and most especially people like John Locke, the Enlightenment figures, Jefferson, the other founding fathers of the United States of America, all the way up through 20th century Democrats, put a great emphasis on public education, because it's that education that makes public decision-making rational, is one of the main lines of the justification of democracy. And also, this idea that because of that, because everyone's involved in deciding for themselves, so everyone's been involved in the public policy, here's a really fascinating point. It makes them brave, not in a kind of blind way, but it makes them brave because they know the real meaning of what they're defending. Now this goes right to the heart of what is the purpose of Pericles' speech. Remember, we always have to ask, what's the motivation? What is this speech attempting to accomplish? What's going on here? Pericles is trying to inspire his troops, who are very demoralized. There have been a lot of deaths, and Sparta seems to be winning, and there's been this plague. And part of what Pericles is saying here is our type of bravery here in Athens comes out of a deep understanding of why we fight, out of the meaning of it. And if a king just ordered us, say if it was Hammurabi, and just told everybody, hey, go jump into battle, it wouldn't actually be connected to their own understanding of why they fight. It would be something they'd be doing blindly. Whereas Athenians reflect and have to be, because it's a democracy, they have to be persuaded to fight. And if they're persuaded to fight, they'll all personally be connected to the meaning of that battle. And otherwise, it wouldn't be. So this idea, which is again connected to isegoria, it's again connected to this principle of democracy in which political decisions not only have to be made by the people, since it is a democracy, but the society compels it. The society shames anyone who says, oh, I don't care that much about politics. In ancient Greece, that was a scandal. Notice what he's saying. If someone says, oh, I'm not interested so much in politics, you don't say that that's someone who minds his own business. You say that's someone who doesn't even have a right to be here. So if you're bored by politics, an Athenian would say, that's a big betrayal of your role as a citizen. Because it's imperative that you participate in politics. So this value of isegoria, of everyone's speech should be counted, everyone's speech should matter, every citizen in a democracy, is not only a right or something you're allowed to do, but it's also an imperative. It's something that you have to do. It's a law. It's a principle of Athenian democracy that contributes to its legitimacy. So I want you to think about those things. One of the things I would encourage you to think about is contrasting Pericles' description of democracy with your own understanding of democracy in the contemporary world. For instance, perhaps isegoria is actually more extensive than American free speech. Think about that. Think about what is the role of free speech in the United States right now. And as for freedom, what's your understanding of freedom? I mean, I've laid out some of these ideas of positive and negative freedom, and we're going to have a lot more chances to think about it. But just jumping in right now, what's your impression of freedom? How do you understand it? Does freedom mean being able to, choose whatever you want to watch on Netflix tonight? And by the way, I'm not putting that type of freedom down. Notice how important for Pericles is the ability to have freedom of what arts and recreations you'll choose to enjoy. Don't assume that choosing what you want to watch for Netflix tonight is really just superficial or meaningless. But maybe there is a type of freedom that's even more significant. Maybe not. But there's things to think about. What is freedom for you? And last, as it comes to isonomia, so far we've been looking at a lot of examples of people who advocate for equality before the law. Here's a hint towards what I call the most challenging question, and this transitions us into the Melian dialogue. If there's a sort of equality with respect to the law, one might say also that therefore the law exists among equals. Law is a relationship among people who have a certain type of equality. This sets up a question of, does that mean that there is therefore no justice or no law among unequals? And this is a sort of mystery or question. It's not a mystery, but this is a question that's posed by the Melian dialogue. So the two key sections I gave you for focus in the Melian dialogue are on the scope of justice and on the favor of the gods. Should say on the favor of the gods. Okay. So on the scope of justice, you have the Athenians' argument from the beginning where they say, look, we're invading you, but we're not going to explain, we're not going to justify ourselves according to a certain kind of right or a certain kind of justice. Instead, and here's the really critical line, all the way at the end of the first paragraph, you know as well as we do, when these matters are discussed by practical people, the standard of justice depends on the equality of the power to compel. And in fact, the strong do what they have the power to do and the weak accept it. So yeah, that phrase, the standard of justice depends on the equality of the power to compel. I'd really like you to think about what that means. uh, yeah, what does that mean that the standard of justice depends on the equality of the power to compel? Uh, just a hint, this is not a easily disputed argument. In the 19th century, uh, the great sociologist Weber famously made the argument that the state holds. How do we know what the state is? Well, the state has a monopoly of legitimate violence. So they have the right to legitimate violence. They have a monopoly on it. That's the definition of the state for Weber. And there's some connection between that idea and this one. However, the Melians then set out to try to persuade the Athenians, okay, like, if you only care about force and you're putting justice off the table, let's see if we can convince you. And this is sort of the brilliance of the Melian argument. They try to say, well, in our view, since you forced us to leave justice out, it is at any rate useful. They want to say that it's useful, so it's a benefit. Look, Athenians, you've said we can't talk about justice, fine, we'll follow your rules. I think it would be beneficial, useful, that you should not destroy a principle that is to the general good of all men, namely, that in the case of all those who fall into danger, there should be such a thing as fair play, and that such people should be allowed to use and to profit by arguments that fall short of a mathematical accuracy. So this is kind of fascinating. The Melians' argument is fair play. They're not even saying necessarily, because they've been forced not to, that fair play is right, but they think that fair play is actually beneficial, net beneficial to the Athenians, that having this be a universal principle would actually be in their long-term, perhaps, self-interest. I'd like you to think about that too. What would that mean? Do you think that fairness is the strategy of the suckers of history, so to speak, which is sort of what the Athenians seem to be at first saying, although careful. But yeah, is fairness the ideal of the suckers of history, or is fairness potentially a beneficial idea, even if we put aside the idea of right? Could the idea of fair play be beneficial, or are the Melians making a terrible mistake? Also take a look at this discussion on the favor of the gods. So the Melians, as it looks like they're not succeeding in persuading the Athenians, finally say, well, at least God is on our side because we are right. We are standing up for what is right. And the Athenians say something very fascinating. They say, well, actually, we have an equal right to claim that God is on our side because it's a truth of nature and as decreed by God. Take a look here. So this is in the last paragraph on the handout. Our aims and our actions are perfectly consistent with the beliefs men hold about the gods. Our opinions of the gods and our knowledge of men lead us to conclude that it is a general and necessary law of nature to rule whatever one can. This is not a law that we made ourselves, nor were we the first to act upon it when it was made. We found it already in existence, and we shall leave it to exist forever among those who come after us. We're merely acting in accordance with it. Now, clicking off in your mind should be a couple of things. One is the discussion of unwritten laws in Pericles' speech, because they're saying they found this law. It's not a human law. It's not something created. And so they're merely obeying a absolute law that applies whether it's a democracy or a monarchy or an oligarchy. And so they think they're also following a sort of understanding that they could call divine, although they associate it with nature, a kind of a natural law. They're only doing what's natural. And in that way, they contrast the Melians' appeal to the gods with a very different appeal to the gods. So that's enough for the passages that I want you to focus on. Some other things that you might think about are, for instance, the discussion in the funeral oration of the democracy's role with the outside world, particularly this use of the phrase, an education to Greece. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that Athens has an educational role with respect to the rest of Greece? We've seen already the role of education inside the democracy, but what about the role of education outside the democracy? And then how does that contrast with Milos? Something else that you could jump in and talk about on the discussion board is, does this remind you of any contemporary events or historical events since then? So one example would be, or one question would be, can you think of any examples of situations where a society has justified its relationship to the rest of the world as an educational one, that it's bringing a kind of uh, informational or scientific or enlightening effect on the rest of the world. There are many examples, not just one. So I'd be curious what you take from that. And then the example of Athens and its colony Milos. What about that? Do you see that logic anywhere else? This logic of the logic, either one, either the logic that Athens justifies its conquest of Milos by, or the logic that Milos uses to defend itself. Um, and if we could think of Pericles as a synthesis, in a way, of Hammurabi and the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, uh, what would a synthesis of Milos and Athens look like? It is a question that I'd be very curious to hear what you think about. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I have a few thoughts. In any case, I hope you jump in. I'll respond on the discussion board to your discussion about Trump and Black Lives Matter. But yeah, let's stir the pot, guys. I hope you have a great week. I'll talk to you via video on the end. And I'll also, I've been thinking about trying to set up some Skype meetups or maybe Google Hangouts now that there's only 20 of you, which is great news, by the way, because it means we can really do a lot more activities, and you'll be able to get a lot more personalized attention from me, which is good for both of us. In any case, have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Ciao.